computer. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Thomas Kindell. He has a PhD and specializes in educating the church and anybody on apologetics and especially creation science. He's one of many top level, I consider him a world-class speaker. Such a blessing to have him here to speak on this. He has been strongly associated with ICR. He's been on Science, Scripture, and Salvation several times. He is an author, a lecturer, a debater. He has been a personal mentor to me over the years. I have listened to anything he's had to say and on DVD or way back when they had cassette tapes, and I would just loop them and I would just listen and listen. So there's a lot of depth to what he's going to say. And tonight, we're going to have Dr. Thomas Kindell speaking on gaps in the fossil record as predicted by creation science. We expect that there's distinct kinds that will reproduce after their own distinct kinds. Now, we know there's biological limitations that all species can have, but there's limits. And those limits, the evolutionists don't like to admit it, they cannot be broken. And so Dr. Kindell is going to talk about the evidence of that, specifically not in living creatures tonight, but in the fossil record. Of course, he'll also probably mention that the fossil record, for the most part, is from Noah's flood. It's not over millions of years of evolution, but rather from Noah's flood. So we're really excited to hear, hey, Chris Osborne, God bless you. Go ahead and mute yourself, brother. Thanks for coming. We definitely want to hear from you a little later. We also have another PhD scientist in our audience. That's a blessing. And one of our other speakers as well. So Tom, take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint up here.
Yes.
See, it's come up just yet. There we go. All right. I want to get down to the presentation. Okay, can everybody see the screen all right? Garth, can you see it all right?
Yeah, yeah, do that again. You put up your screen and then you backed out. So try it again.
Oh, it doesn't have it up?
No. Reshare your screen.
Okay, let's see how I'm going to do this. So you're not seeing anything at all then, huh?
Not at the moment.
Understand what's going on here. It always seems to work when we do the test at the beginning, and then it doesn't work when we need it. You know, it seems to be.
Just start by going to the bottom and hovering over share screen. Click on that share screen green.
Yeah, I can't seem to get out of my PowerPoint for some reason.
Oh, you're in your PowerPoint? Go to the top of your. You don't have to get out of your PowerPoint. You can leave it there. You can minimize it if you want.
Yeah, it's not giving me a minimization icon to use.
If you go up to the top and just hover over the top of your screen, does any share screen
Nothing coming up? No.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, let's see if we can get
and what I'm going to do, Tom, is I'm going to stop you from being co-host, and then I'll reestablish you as co-host.
Okay. So I got out of the PowerPoint, but I don't know what to do to get it up.
Okay, go ahead and try it again.
Should I hit share?
Huh?
Should I hit share?
Yeah, share screen. And then you can click on screen if you want. Or if you see your PowerPoint, you can click on that.
Okay. Boy.
And if worse comes to worse, you could go get Pam.
Yeah, I may have to do that. He's the techie in my family. Oh, no, that's not the right thing. Okay, I'll get her in just a second.
Okay. Well, Chris, you can unmute yourself for a second. It's so good to see you, man. We got to get you back and put you in the list in the lineup. Yeah.
And Garth, it's been
myself again.
go down and hit your.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
Yeah, I tried that, but they say they're not seeing it.
You're in Zoom. Did you hit share screen?
Where is it at?
Oh, the share screen. Get back up. Hold on.
Yeah, tried that.
Okay. Let me close this out.
So for everybody who's on and just tuning in, we're just having a little technical difficulty. We'll get it straightened out. There, it looks good, Tom. There we go.
Okay.
You nailed it.
Okay, so we can see the screen all right then?
Yeah, we can see your screen just fine.
Okay, very good.
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and you could take it away.
Okay, go ahead and all right, so tonight we're going to be talking about the fossil record confirms creation. And the fossil record is the only historical record we have of the history of life in the past. What would be ideal with the scientific method would be to invent a time machine and to go into that time machine, go back in the past and see if we can go millions of years and see if we can see evolution over millions of years. According to the Bible, we wouldn't be able to go back much further than about 6,000 years. But since we haven't invented a time machine, the next best thing we have is to go to the fossil record and see if the history of life preserved in the fossil record agrees with the prediction made by Darwinian evolution or agrees with the prediction that would be made by special creation or biblical creation. So Darwin's classic theory, he admitted in his famous book on the origin of species that it would cause innumerable transitional forms to have lived and died over the many millions of years. And as they lived and died and got buried in these halfway stages, there would be a continuous chain leading from one kind to another to another. In fact, there'd probably be more transitions than there would be complete creatures because so much of this evolution going on. But the creation model, of course, predicts differently that the basic kinds of life forms were created supernaturally rather quickly, and that there never were any transitions between them. They were created fully designed, fully developed, fully implemented, fully capable of being diagnosed as to where they belong, what kind of family, order, class, phylum they belong to, because all the diagnostic and distinguishing characteristics were there complete and perfect from the beginning, as would be expected, being the work of an omnipotent creator who doesn't make mistakes. So we really can't prove in the scientific sense anything that happened in the past because we can't repeat history in the past. So both creation and evolution from a scientific perspective have to operate as scientific models. Now, a model is not something that you can prove by direct observation, but it's a conceptual framework that helps us to correlate and interpret the available data and to make predictions. And of course, the obvious prediction of Darwinian evolution would be these innumerable transitional forms, such as we see in the top illustration there. Supposedly the first species, the single cell, evolved, even though it's far more complex than any machine man has ever made or really ever dreamed of making. And it's, even the theoretical smallest possible living creature that meets the criteria for life, the basic criteria being metabolism, being able to produce energy either by photosynthesis or by digestion and metabolism, homeostasis, keeping everything running smoothly as it should be, nothing getting out of control that could easily become lethal. And of course, reproduction, because without reproduction, there is no posterity. That's the end of the line. So metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, the theoretically smallest entity that could do that would be smaller than any living cell we know living today, and it would be more complex than any machine that we ever made, also requiring hundreds of very complex chemical machines in their own right called enzymes and proteins, as well as DNA, RNA, ribosomes, all that. So it is mathematically, chemically, physically, thermodynamically impossible to explain that cell based on what we do know. They basically try to cloud the issue with anything can happen in millions of years. And that, of course, takes it completely out of the scientific domain because we can't test millions of years in any laboratory. They just have to take it by blind faith. And, the laws don't change with time. The law of gravity doesn't change with time. Water will spontaneously run downhill and not uphill. We can force it uphill with a pump and with plumbing. But if we let the natural laws do it goes naturally, a billion years from now, water will still run downhill. It is under the law of gravity, and the laws don't change with time. That's why they're called laws. And it's the laws themselves that stand as an insuperable barrier to that origin of that first cell. So that's a big one there. The transition, they believe, took place from non-living chemistry, non-living matter, to living cell, more complex than anything we've ever made. Then the cell supposedly evolved into, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cell, 5 cell, 10 cell, 100 cell, 1,000 cell, 100,000 cell, multi-million cells. And so we don't see this transition from a single cell to the multi-million cell creatures that explode into existence in the so-called Cambrian age. We have like the Burgess Shale in Canada that's just teeming with life, obviously an ocean bottom ecology, and it just explodes on the scene. We have nothing between the extreme of single-celled and then these multi-million cell creatures. If creation is true, God spoke the single-cell creatures into existence and the multi-million cell creatures, all the various kinds, order, class, phyla, etc., and therefore there never were any of these transitions. So the evidence that the evolutionists need is really not there. Darwin admitted that. He said that didn't prove his theory was wrong. God called it an obvious and serious objection that evidence wasn't there. But he said in time it will show up because he was sure his theory was true. Of course, the converse of that is if it doesn't show up in a reasonable amount of time, and it's been about 164 years now since Darwin published his book, then there is a time limit to where it should have showed up. Our knowledge of the fossil record is now more than 100-fold greater than it was in Darwin's day. And the gaps have gotten worse because we've discovered all kinds of different life forms we didn't even know existed in the fossil record in Darwin's day. That requires all kinds of transitions to lead up to them, and yet we don't have transitions for them either. So it has gotten worse and worse with time rather than better and better. So they used to say that between the single cell and these complex marine creatures we find in the Cambrian, there was as much as 3 billion years of evolution without leaving any evidence. Now, the creationists, of course, picked up on that and said, how in the world can you believe in a theory that had 3 billion years of transformation, of all this changing, all these transitions, all these ancestors, and yet there's nothing there? We find many billions of beautifully preserved fossils in the fossil record, but for some reason, we don't get these transitions and these ancestors. How can that be plausible? And in reacting to that, the evolutionists said, well, maybe, if we shorten the time, maybe it won't look quite so bad. So we see that, Time magazine a number of years ago came out with Evolution's Big Bang, and they're not talking about the cosmological evolution of the origin of the universe, that type of Big Bang, but rather an alleged biological Big Bang. And so they say that life exploded supposedly for billions of years. Simple creatures like plankton, bacteria, and algae ruled the earth. Then suddenly life got very complicated. Well, you got to explain that. What is the mechanism to cause these very simple creatures to very rapidly, on a geological timescale, at least rapidly to them, they say a period of at least 10 million years, no more than that. It transformed from single cells to all these 30 plus different phyla that we find in the Cambrian. So whether you say it happened slow or fast, you have to have a credible mechanism. And all they have is random destructive mutations, blind random destructive mutations, which don't improve the genetic code. It's like a typographical errors that garble information. It degrades information. It doesn't have the ability, based on all the experiments and based on information science, random changes in any information system will ultimately destroy it. It doesn't make it better. Natural selection can select, the lesser of two evils, the less corrupted information over worse corrupted information. But if the very creative process, the random mutations, can't produce new and better information, then natural selection can't select anything new and better. Therefore, it's a dead-end theory. But whether they say it happened fast or slow, since they don't have a really credible mechanism, it's just storytelling. Anyway, we find also that they say that there was a burst of creativity we see in the upper left-hand corner there. I think it was a burst of creation, according to the Bible and according to the evidence. So they're now obliged to say that for billions of years, nothing but these single-celled creatures were on Earth, very simple. And then in just this 10 million year window, kaboom, we get all this vast amounts of very, very different life forms. And what's amazing is that they admit that the bulk of the really large scale evolution that is supposed to have taken place during the evolutionary saga took place here in the Cambrian age. We get virtually all the phyla there, about 30 some different major body plans. And that includes the phyla that we're a part of, or the phylum, I should say, that we're a part of, which is the chordates, and the subphylum being vertebrates. Chordates are those that have a nerve cord going down their back from their brain, or in the case of vertebrates, they not only have a nerve cord, a spinal cord, but also a vertebral column or backbone. And since we have now found, and we've known this for quite a number of years now, they didn't admit it for a long time, but it's now admitted that they have found fish, vertebrate fish in the Cambrian, then even the phylum that we are a member of, both chordates and the subphylum of vertebrates, is found in the Cambrian. So they say that most all of the major diversification, the major new origination of body plans that took place in the course of evolution, 66 to 75% of it, thereabouts, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of it, took place here in the so-called big explosion. So that's a lot to have to try to stomach, that in just 10 million years this happened by blind random destructive mutations, which is not a viable mechanism. But they claim that because it happened so fast, it didn't leave much evidence, and that's why we don't find this evidence. I don't find that to be a credible argument, because they claim there's plenty of transitions between an ape-like creature and man over what they claim is only about 6 million years. Now, all of those alleged ape men, that's a whole different presentation I do, but it's even worse than the rest of the fossil record. But they claim that you can get plenty of transitions, but nobody has any argument or debate here about the transitions of the ancestors. There are no ancestors, there are no transitions, there's simply nothing there. And so they basically have lame excuses as to why the evidence does not exist. So basically they're admitting the evidence isn't there, but they say, oh, we've got excuses, and therefore you should believe evolution is a fact. Can you imagine going into a court of law and telling the judge, well, Your Honor, no, we don't have any evidence at all. You've asked for eyewitnesses. You've asked for all kinds of, videotapes or, fingerprints, footprints, blood hair, DNA, anything that would be evidence for our case. No, we don't have any evidence, but we do have some excuses why the evidence does not exist. Is that good enough? Well, of course, it wouldn't be. The judge would throw the book at them and say, I don't care about excuses. Excuses are not admissible in a court of law. You bring me some concrete, credible evidence of which you admit there is none. Sorry, you can't use excuses in lieu of real evidence. And that's exactly what the evolutionists are doing here. One of their main excuses is that supposedly the Cambrian fauna evolved from soft-bodied creatures, and since soft-bodied creatures don't usually get preserved in the fossil record, therefore we wouldn't expect to have any record of it. But we do in fact find soft-bodied creatures all over the world. In fact, worms, snails, jellyfish, The Ediacaran fauna, so named because of being found near Ediacara, Australia. Those are all soft-bodied creatures, and we have found them now on 5 different continents. So if we get soft-bodied creatures all over the world, and the Ediacaran in particular, 5 different continents, it's not a legitimate argument to say, well, there's absolutely nothing there because it's impossible to get soft-bodied creatures to fossilize. No, we have the single-celled creatures, bacteria, algae, plankton, very soft, very small, very tiny and delicate. They're fossilized. So where are all these missing links? They should be there. It's simply inconceivable that the greatest amount of evolution, as far as the biggest transformations of morphological change, took place here. And this is also where we have perhaps the richest amount of fossils in the fossil record. For both reasons, there should be more transitional and ancestor evidence here than any other place in the world of the fossil record, and there's absolutely nothing. So, you can have all the excuses you want. It looks like creation. It looks like single cells were created, multi-million cell creatures were created. They were created functionally perfect. All the diagnostic and designating features that put them in their particular family, order, class, phyla, et cetera, are already there. It's not difficult to put them in proper categories because they're not halfway this and halfway that, where we can't figure out what in the world category they ought to fit into. The evidence shows that it looks like just what the Bible says. He spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. Rapid, special, supernatural creation took place. So this, I think, is lethal to the theory. We really don't even need to look at any other place in the fossil record. It's inconceivable that all these millions of years could have gone on with these creatures living and dying. Soft-bodied creatures do in fact get preserved. They aren't there. A lot of these creatures, in fact, the most common creature in the fossil record are basically shellfish, clams and other shellfish, which have hard shells. And those, like skeletons, tend to get preserved a lot better as fossils than soft parts. That's true. But how did we get all this evolution of all these shelly creatures with their hard parts and have absolutely no trace, no transition, no ancestors? It jumps from single-celled creatures to these multi-million celled creatures, incredibly diverse, 30 different, some phyla, and including the phyla that we're a part of. And we're in the phylum, again, chordates. Those have a nerve cord from the brain, and also the subphylum of vertebrates. And that's such a big category right there to emphasize how big and dramatically different these categories are. For example, in the subphylum that we are in, vertebrates, that constitutes such things as fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and of course, man himself. But we all have that big anatomical distinguishment that we have a vertebral column and a nerve cord. And so that's a big subphylum category, but there's 30-some different phyla with big differences in their morphological design. Consequently, it's just inconceivable. It stretches the imagination. It's too much to ask. This is a lethal flaw. And how many flaws does a theory have to have before it's no longer credible? Just one will do. Well, here's a great big one. And until they can answer this, we don't really have to put up with them talking about anything else in the fossil record. They need to earn the right to say their theory is credible, and that is you find all these missing transitions. Making it just 10 million years instead of 3 billion years does not solve the problem, because like I said, in as little as 6 million years, they're supposedly had all these ape men, and they have 10 million years, two-thirds longer than that, 6 million years. Millions times millions of these creatures would have lived and died, and they should have transitions by the many thousands in every museum in the world because of that, but it's just not there. So at face value, this gap is lethal. It confirms what the Bible predicts. If creation took place, that's exactly what you would see. If God created single-celled creatures and multi-million-celled creatures and did not have any transitions between them, then that's how it would look. It looks that way in the living world, and it looks that way in the fossil record as well, just like what the Bible predicts. Now then, they claim that until about 600 million years ago, life on Earth consisted of algae, bacteria, and plankton. Then at the beginning of the Cambrian period, in a burst of creativity lasting no more than 10 million years, nature, not God, produced an astonishing array of multicellular animals by a mechanism, of course, that doesn't work. And I would think all they have to really change here is the word burst of creativity to a burst of creation, and instead of nature, a creator God, and they'd be spot on. It does indeed look like that. Now, here they say complex creatures with teeth and tentacles and claws and jaws, all these new innovations, just appeared, materialized with the suddenness of apparitions. Well, I'd say they materialized with the suddenness of special creation. That's what the Bible says, and this confirms it. I mean, what better evidence could you find than these rapid appearance without any ancestors or transitions of these wildly diverse creatures with no transitions leading up to them whatsoever? Exactly what the Bible predicts, but absolutely contrary to the neo-Darwinian theory. Now, here we have the quote by J.W. Valentine and D.H. Irwin, both evolutionist experts in the fossil record. And when they talk about ancestors or intermediates between the higher taxa, the higher categories of zoological classification, he said it would be in the rocks of the late Precambrian to Ordovician times when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved, but transitional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed, notice, for any of the phyla or classes. None. That's about as blank a slate as you can get, and it is inconceivable that all this evolution, the biggest portion of evolution ever happened in the history of evolution, took place and left nothing. And, they've got to use lame excuses. Well, it happened in just the right way. It didn't leave any evidence. I mean, you imagine going into a court of law and say, Your Honor, we want you to find the defendant here guilty of first-degree capital murder. And the judge says, well, okay, I understand the charge, but you have to understand in my court, we actually need something. We need evidence, not just prejudiced theories against the defendant. Do you have any eyewitnesses? Well, no, sir, we don't have any. Do you have any video footage? No. Do you have any evidence that he's from a different state? Do you have any evidence he was even in this state or in this city at the time the crime was committed? Well, no, sir, we don't have that either. Do you have any fingerprints, hair, blood, DNA evidence, anything like that, footprints, something that would tie the defendant to the scene of the crime? Well, no, Your Honor, we don't have any evidence at all, but we do have this theory that he was a criminal mastermind, and he thought this out very carefully. And he decided to steal a car in the state he lived in, drive across straight lines. He changed the license plate so it couldn't be traced to him. He wore a disguise so that in case any eyewitnesses saw him, they would not recognize or properly identify him. And before he went into the house to commit the murder, he put on a biochem defense suit so that there would be no hair or skin flakes or fingerprints or any DNA evidence of his left at the scene of the crime. And Your Honor, because we have this theory that he is a criminal mastermind and he conceived this amazing way to do the crime without leaving any incriminating evidence, therefore, Your Honor, we demand that you find him guilty of murder. Of course, the judge would say, get the Sam Hill out of my court. This is absurd. You have nothing but your prejudiced theories against the defendant. You have no evidence whatsoever to link him to the scene of the crime, much less to prove that he did anything. And you're saying because you have a theory that he did it in a way as to leave no evidence, that therefore that constitutes evidence? I mean, it's absurd. I'm going to throw the book at you. Get out of my court, or I'm going to find you guilty of contempt for bringing such ridiculous arguments into my court. That's what would happen in a court of law. And it ought to be the same way in academia. It ought to be the same way in science. You're not allowed to have a pet theory that has no evidence, but because you can think of some wild theories as to why or how it could have happened without leaving any evidence, that somehow that constitutes positive evidence. It does not. Whatever theories they have, they cannot debate, they cannot dispute the fact that there simply is no evidence. And if there is no evidence, there is no case. Now then, if I can get this thing to work, there we go. Now, Alfred Romer of Harvard University, he admitted that below this Cambrian strata are vast thicknesses of sediments in which the progenitors, meaning the evolutionary ancestors and missing links, would be expected. But we do not find them. These older beds are almost barren of life, and the general picture could reasonably be consistent with the idea of special creation. In other words, supernatural, biblical type of creation. Well, he's certainly right. It's not only just the general picture, it's the whole picture. it looks like exactly what creation would predict. He probably got in trouble in the evolutionary fraternity for being so honest in his assessment, but what he is saying is very true. It doesn't look like evolution. It does look like and is consistent with special creation. Now, once we get past that lethal gap, which we really shouldn't have to, we should demand that they give evidence, otherwise the whole theory is not credible. It's impossible to believe all this change happened, the bulk of the change in all of evolutionary history, and left nothing. No matter what excuses they may give, they're admitting there is no evidence. They have to, there's no evidence there. That's the end of the theory. But let's look at some of the other gaps. Supposedly between invertebrates, which are creatures that don't have an inside skeleton or backbone, they're soft-bodied, and where they have an outside exoskeleton or whatever, they don't have a vertebral column, they don't have inside skeleton. There's supposed to be hundreds of thousands of missing links between them. And yet in the fossil record, with all these many, many millions of years that they allege allowed this transformation to take place, how many of these millions times millions of creatures again would have lived and died? We have tons and tons of invertebrates fossilized in the fossil record, tons and tons of fish, but none of this trail of ancestors, none of these missing links. In fact, just about any one time or another, evolutionists have speculated that just about every different kind of invertebrate was the possible ancestor of the vertebrate fish. And the reason they can't come to a consensus or agree is because there's simply no trail of evidence showing where it came from. It's believed by blind faith, another huge impossible gap, impossible to believe, and again showing the theory has no evidence. And by the way, of course, these same gaps exist in the living world because kind reproduces after its own kind. They were created separately. There never were transitions. Transitions aren't happening today. And it's interesting how they say why there isn't. They say, well, you can't see evolution happening today. It takes millions of years, so you won't live long enough to see it. Well, that's not really a valid argument, because if it is an ongoing process, as they claim, then some of it must have been started a few million years ago, and yet won't be destined to be complete until a few million years in the future, which means some of these evolving creatures would be in the transitionary period during our lifetime. We ought to be able to see that. But the same type of systematic gaps that we see in the fossil record persist in the living world. Now, in the past, they're trying to say, well, it did happen, but it happened so fast that it really didn't leave any evidence in the fossil record. Yet today, when we ask, why can't we see it today? They say, well, it happened so slow that you can't see it. So it's always happening, supposedly, but it's always happening too fast or too slow, or there's some other excuse as to why you can't actually see it. And yet science is based on repeated experimentation and observation. Repeated observations prove what is scientifically true, but by their very definition, you can't test evolution. The main magic wand that's supposed to make it work is something that's completely untestable. Millions of years. Who can set up an experiment that will last for millions of years? And yet with everything we do know, we can predict that even with millions of years, it couldn't work. But they will always say, yeah, but if we had millions of years, it would work. Well, that's simply not a testable hypothesis. It's just believing what you want to believe with an untestable theory, and then having the audacity to claim that it's a scientific fact. One can't even qualify even as a testable theory. Now, in a series of quotations from Alfred Romer, again, of Harvard, Dr. Gish, Dwayne Gish, who's passed away, he was my mentor at ICR and a wonderful man. Gish finds all the confessions he needs from the evolutionists that each of these classes appears suddenly and with no trace of ancestors. Now he's talking about the various classes of fish. We have fish, and within that category of fish, we have these distinctly different kinds and groupings of fish, but we don't find any transitions between them to show how one evolved into the other. So the absence of the transitional fossils and the gaps between each group of fishes and its ancestor is repeated in standard treatises on vertebrate evolution. Even Chris McGowan's 1984 anti-creationist work, purporting to show, quote, why the creationists are wrong, makes no mention of these pages of text on the origin of the fish classes. Knowing that McGowan is an authority on vertebrate paleontology, keen on faulting the creationists at every opportunity, I must assume that I haven't missed anything important in this area. This is one count in the creationist charge that can only evoke in unison from the paleontologists, meaning the fossil scientists, a plea of nolo contendere, which is a legal term which means no contest, or in other words, guilty as charged. there's not only a huge gap between invertebrates and fish, even within the distinctly different types of fish, there's also nothing but gaps. Now, the transition from fish to amphibian, they allege, would have taken something like 50 million years of these creatures living and dying. We have all kinds of fish, all kinds of amphibians in the fossil record, but we don't have any clear-cut transitions. Now, as we can see, looking at the vertebrate anatomy here, the bone anatomy, there's a whale of a big difference between fish and amphibians. This is especially obvious when we take a look at the fish and the amphibian at the cross-sectional view. Notice on the left cross-section of the amphibian at the pelvic region, we find that the limbs support the body weight of the body. The pelvic bones are enlarged and firmly attached to the vertebral column. So you have to have articulated bone structure in the legs, actual feet, toe bones. They can plant themselves on the ground, articulated bones. They can raise the body above the ground so it can actually walk above the ground. And you have to have this very strong buttressing, both at the bottom and at the top, where these bones connect to the vertebral column. Now you notice the cross-section of the fish on the right. The fins serve only for balancing and steering. The pelvic bones are small and loosely embedded in muscle. So we would have to see a transition where these bones that are used for balancing and steering grow, and they make a connection at the bottom, and they grow and make this very strong connection at the top to the vertebral column. That would be an obvious transition, to see these things growing and beginning to connect. What an obvious transition, but nothing like that exists. All fish, living or fossil, have this basic anatomy. All amphibians, living or fossil, have the same anatomy. No clear-cut transition at all. Now, a way to get around that, of course, is simply to hire an artist to draw a picture of what they believe happened. And we see this at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History in this display called Conquest of the Land. Their legs evolved from fish fins. Notice it says the transition from water to land was accomplished by the evolution of body supports unnecessary in the locomotion of fishes. But notice the caption under that piece of artwork in the center. It says inferred intermediate. Inferred indeed. It has never been found to exist anywhere in the fossil record or in the living world. So when they don't have the evidence, which is what science is all about, they simply hire an artist to draw an imaginary picture of what they think. Then they've actually told the creationists, the problem with you creationists is you don't have good enough imaginations. We can imagine evolution happening, why can't you? Well, it's not, science is not about who has the best imagination, it's about who has the concrete evidence, and they keep making cartoon pictures based on nothing and say that that's good enough because our problem is we don't have enough imagination. I fail to see the logic in that critique. Now then, Tiktaalik, this has been the big alleged transition between fish and amphibians. Bill Nye, in his famous debate with Ken Ham, made a big deal about Tiktaalik. But when we look at it, it is a fish. It breathes like a fish, it's got the gills. It has the same types of fins and anatomy as fish. Again, there is no growing of those loosely embedded fin bones growing up to make connections to the vertebral column at the top and the bottom as is necessary. So it looks a little different, but its basic anatomy is light years from an amphibian, just like all fish living or fossil today. But they're desperate. So we find a different kind of looking fish, still has the basic anatomy of all fish, but that's good enough. They need it to be the transition. So they put it on the chart and it becomes basically psychological warfare against our children by saying, Siri, here we have this proof. And yet when you ask, well, where is the obvious transition of those bones connecting? It's not in Tiktaalik, it's not in any of these fish. And therefore the gap remains, whether they like it or not. Now here we have this new species of bumper sticker excites interest in the US Southwest. These Darwin stickers have been around for many years now. And it always hit me as so ironic. The fish symbol has been used from the days of the early church as a symbol of Christianity, ichthus in Greek being a acronym for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. So they thought we'll hijack the fish, just like almost, I guess, like the homosexuals have hijacked God's rainbow, a symbol of his covenant, never again to flood the earth, and use that as a symbol for their rebellion. But they've hijacked our fish and put feet on it, and put the name Darwin on there as if we have a scientific fish. We have a fish with feet, and it's completely unscientific because nobody has ever found a fish with feet. As I pointed out, all fish anatomy is basically the same. Certainly, none of them have feet. And so they use as their icon to mock Christians an unscientific creature that has never been known to exist in the living world or the fossil record. And yet by making this up, they think somehow they've made a scientific statement. It's really rather sad. Now, Archaeopteryx, the name means ancient wing, found back in the 1800s. And it appears to be a bird. The more we've studied it, it appears to be a fully feathered, fully flight capable bird. And so when we look at the various parts of anatomy, it had a bird-like pubis, not reptilian-like. It had a bird-like hollow bones and lungs. The lungs of birds are radically different from reptiles. It had a bird-like otic region, which means the ear region. And we don't see it, halfway between what a reptile and what a bird would be. It's fully bird-like. Also, we find that its cranial structure is like that of birds, not reptiles. It had complete wings, feathers, and a furcula or wishbone. And these wings and feathers, the analysis shows that nothing would have forbidden it from being a fully powered flying bird, not a flightless bird. It had asymmetrical veins in the feather structure to produce an aerofoil design for lift. And it also had perching feet, which comes in real handy for flying birds that want to perch on tree limbs. It's not like what we have in reptiles. And one of the big things they made a deal about is that it had teeth. They say, well, there aren't any birds living today that had teeth. The fact it had teeth proves it evolved from a reptile. But it had bird-like teeth. You see, there's some birds in the fossil record that have gone extinct, but they lived in the past, and everybody agrees they were nothing but birds. But they didn't have teeth. And some birds had teeth and some didn't. In fact, throughout, the different classes of animals, we find that some fish have teeth and some don't. Some amphibians have teeth and some don't. Some reptiles have teeth and some don't. It's supposed to prove it evolved from a reptile, but some reptiles don't have teeth, like turtles. Some mammals have teeth and some don't, like the spiny anteater has no teeth. And I might venture to say that some of you listening, some of you have teeth and some don't, at least not the originals anyway. Might have dentures. You might say, well, I paid for them. They belong to me. They're my teeth. Yeah, but maybe not the originals. Anyway, absence or not of teeth doesn't prove anything because we have so many creatures throughout the different classifications that some have teeth and some don't. But what's interesting is that of the birds that went extinct that had teeth, their teeth were avian. They were bird-like. They were different from reptile teeth. And so even there should be some transition between reptile teeth to bird teeth, but there's no transition there in Archaeopteryx either. So although this has been heralded for many years in the textbooks and on the websites and everything else as proof of evolution, a lot of people don't realize that many highly qualified evolutionists do not accept it. For example, here we have W.E. Swinton, who wrote that the origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. Also, we have Mark Ridley writing in the prestigious Nature magazine, arguably the most prestigious science journal in the world. And this passed peer review, so apparently the peer review board agreed with him. He said, unfortunately, the intermediate stages hardly ever seemed to exist in the fossil record. Huxley, referring to Thomas Huxley's later trumpeting about Archaeopteryx notwithstanding. Thus, he's clearly saying he does not accept Archaeopteryx as a legitimate transitional form. Now then, Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge, some of the most famous evolutionist paleontologists in the history of the theory of evolution, he's saying that this German word here, their Bauplana, which means a distinct type, transitions between these distinct design types are almost impossible to construct, even in thought experiments. In other words, it stretches his imagination. He says there is certainly no evidence for them in the fossil record. Curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count. So here are some of the biggest names in evolutionary paleontology are saying Archaeopteryx does not count, even though we find it in the textbooks and all over the internet. Now, Dr. Colin Patterson had been a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, and the British Museum has perhaps the world's largest assemblage of fossil specimens in the world, even more than the American Museum of Natural History. And I believe that's because, as the old saying was, the sun never set on the British Empire for a while. And they stole a lot of not only archaeological artifacts, but also paleontological fossils. and put them in that museum. But he had at his disposal this huge amount of fossils, and was certainly well aware of Archaeopteryx. But he said, a former senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, he perhaps summed it up the best when he admitted that Archaeopteryx, quote, has simply become a patsy for wishful thinking. Now, you also have here Alan Fiducia, who is an ornithologist. In other words, he is a scientist who studies birds. That's his whole field of expertise. And even though he is an evolutionist, he's honest enough to admit that Archaeopteryx certainly is not proof that we have a transition between reptiles and birds. He says that Archaeopteryx really doesn't tell us much about the early origins of feathers and flight in true protobirds, because Archaeopteryx was, in the modern sense, a bird. He says paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. I thought that was interesting. Paleobabble. Now, A.H. Brush, writing on the origin of feathers in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, says that at the morphological level, feathers are traditionally considered homologous, or in other words, similar with reptilian scales. However, in development, morphogenesis, in other words, the origin of the shape and form generation, gene structure, protein shape and sequence, and filament formation and structure, feathers are different. Well, I should say they're quite different in all those ways. And visibly, they're strikingly different. Basically, reptile scales made out of this tough protein called keratin, such as you have in your hair and you have in your fingernails. These are basically folds of keratin on the surface of the reptile, whereas feathers grow from a follicle, like hair, from underneath the skin, and then as they come up through the skin, they branch out in these beautiful, interlaced, incredibly complex geometric patterns that are designed to link and interact with one another. So on a large flight feather, such as you'd have like from a swan or a big goose, you can have as many as 1 million individual parts in a single feather, because when we look at it microscopically, you see all these many, many thousands and hundreds of thousands of barbules, hooks, and barbs. That is, like the most beautiful engineering design for powered flight. It has to be lightweight, which feathers are. It has to be impervious to the air, so it can trap air and act as an aerofoil, but also has to be strong and resilient. So if it's damaged, if a feather is ruffled or damaged, the bird simply pulls it through its beak and all these tiny little parts zip back together. And as a functionally good feather, again, I mean, it's an absolute marvel of engineering prowess. And to say that blind random accidents in the DNA computer code, so to speak, that specifies the blueprint for reptile scales, and then you have to increase all this complexity to make this truly a stupendous marvel of engineering called a feather, it taxes credulity that they could believe such things, but they do. Now then, even if we did get a transitioning creature, how would this poor creature survive? I mean, you've got here part scales, part feathers, and you've got the front legs have been sacrificed, so it can't run fast like a lizard because it's trying to convert those front legs into wings. Now that means all kinds of neuromuscular changes have to take place. And if it's taking millions of years, then in the halfway stage, the neuromuscular system isn't quite worked out right. And you'd probably be, like a spastic, not able to really control his movement. And he's really in big trouble if a predator shows up, because a lizard can run very quickly and find cover. A bird can fly away very quickly, but this poor, pathetic, halfway creature can't run very well. It certainly can't fly. You'd probably have a spastic attack because it doesn't have the neuromuscular control yet, all evolved, and just make a spectacle of itself and end up being duck soup for any predator in the area. So reptiles can survive fine. Fully developed birds can fly and survive fine, but a halfway creature like this can't even conceivably even survive. So we don't have the transitions. It seems impossible that such a creature could survive anyway. And it's just a kind of a fairy tale for adults. Now, again, in transitioning from a reptile to a bird, we have a tremendous change that would have to take place. And one of the most important things that will kill you within minutes if it doesn't work, and that's your breathing system, your lung system. The lung system in birds is radically different from reptiles. It actually has a continuous throughput of air. Air comes in one tube and flows in one direction through the respiratory tissue through the lung system there. So it's always fresh air. Now in the bellows system, such as we have, you breathe air in and out the same tube. This comes in one tube, is pumped through by these air sacs, which beat in proper synchrony to actually pump it through like a circulatory system. We could actually even refer to these as kind of air hearts, in that they pump the air in a true circulatory manner and pumps it through the system. When one tube comes out another, it doesn't go in and out the same tube. And so the airflow and the blood flow are in a counter current fashion. So they interface, and this allows the blood to extract oxygen more efficiently in birds than any other known vertebrate creature. And this is the key to their tremendous endurance and high altitude performance when they're migrating clear from one continent to another, as they can do on a regular basis. But this is a radically different system. Blind random destructive mutations, we're supposed to take the DNA computer code, so to speak, for a reptile and radically change it to this, all the while preserving respiratory function. It seems like an impossible pipe dream to me. Now, here is Stephen Gould, again, this very famous paleontologist who for many years was the professor of paleontology at Harvard University. He died in 2002, and prior to his death, he was considered to be, by many, the world's leading spokesman for evolution. But even he had some problems and doubts about the theory in certain areas. He said, and I quote, "Even though we have no direct evidence for smooth transitions," now stop right there. He says, we have no direct evidence. All right, so why do the textbooks say we have millions of fossils in the fossil record and every one is a proof for Darwinian evolution? Why? Because they're deceiving the students. When we look at the real experts, the ones that are honest in this regard, he says there is no direct evidence for smooth transitions. Therefore, those fossils are not evidence for evolution, they're evidence for creation, because creation predicted the lack of smooth transitions, lack of any transitions, and the huge gaps, which is what we see all over the fossil record. But then he asks the question, can we invent a reasonable sequence of intermediate forms, that is, viable functioning organisms between ancestors and descendants? Of what possible use are the incipient stages of useful structures? What good is half a jaw or half a wing or half of any structure you need to survive, and you have to wait millions of years before it actually works? Now, this is particularly cogent when we point out that powered flight, according to evolutionists, is supposed to have evolved 4 different times separately in different types of creatures. Those being the bats, the birds, the extinct flying reptiles called pterosaurs, and flying insects. Now, there's nothing more obvious in the fossil record if these transitions took place while these creatures were living and dying over millions of years. Nothing more obvious than a creature that has no wings, and then gradually over millions of years, its living and dying forms preserved in the fossil record show these wings developing in all 4 different types of animals. Again, we have this other problem. Once we get to about position 5 or 6 here, this rat or some kind of rodent that is supposed to be evolved into bats, he probably would have an identity crisis. Once he gets to about stage 6, he doesn't know if he's a rat anymore, and he's not quite a bat. So maybe we would have to call him a brat. You know, well, Mr. Brat has a big problem because, again, if the predators show up, he sacrificed his front legs. Rats can run and scurry very quickly, hard to catch, and bats can fly very fast. I think the fastest on record is a big old bat in South America. They tracked with a helicopter at 99 miles an hour. That's fast. But this guy can't run very well, and he can't fly. And again, his neuromuscular system won't be complete for maybe a few more million years in the future, so it doesn't work very well. He'll just have a spastic attack, make a spectacle of himself, and be eaten by predators. But any way you want to look at it, not only would these creatures be non-viable, there's simply no evidence in the world today or in the fossil record that these transitions ever took place. It's believed by the blindest of blind faith. Now, horse evolution has been one of the icons of evolution for a long time. And the amazing thing is that the beginning of it starts with the Eohippus, which means in the Greek dawn horse. It's also called the Hyracotherium because it really is nothing but a hyrax. Hyrax is a rock badger. Well, they had to stick something at the base because they didn't have anything. They looked around for a creature that had multiple toes, 4 on the front and 3 on the rear, that could supposedly transition into the 3-toed horse, the Mesohippus. So they just stuck it there. There's no evidence that it ever was anything but a rock badger. But then once you get above the alleged Eohippus, the rock badger, the Hyracotherium, we find all these others are distinctly horses. Now, they are somewhat different. Again, they have some different numbers of toes or hooves. Some of them have different numbers of ribs. So they are indeed different, but morphologically, they are distinctly horses. We have a situation like that today where we have this broad category of creatures called apes. The three great apes living today would be the chimpanzees, the orangutans, and the gorilla. And these are obviously very distinctly different. We believe these three types of apes were separately created by the creator, but they fit in that overarching broad category of apes. And here the creator apparently created 4 different kinds of horses that are different in some ways, but in the broad category, they all fit into that category of equus or horse. And so there really is no need to say there's any evolution there. You know, you get rid of the rock badger, it's just a series of horses. And they don't even have them in the right order. For example, the alleged modern horse at the top with hooves in South America, we find it in reverse order of what is depicted here, with it on the bottom lower layers and the Mesohippus is supposed to be the earliest one on top. But it really doesn't matter what order you find them in. They'll put it in the order they want on the chart, again, as a weapon of psychological warfare against our children. Now, although the animals above form a series, it is not an evolutionary series. Why not? I mean, if we found these animals as nothing but fossils in the fossil record, it would be so easy to say, oh yes, the dik-dik evolved into the bigger gazelle, and that into the bigger bushbuck, and that into the bigger gnu, and that into the bigger eland. And they could put it in a chart, and instead of evolution of the horse, it's the evolution of the eland starting with the dik-dik. And the only problem is that all of these creatures are alive and well and live contemporaneously on the continent of Africa today. So just the fact that you can put these creatures in a series from small to big and tell a story about it doesn't constitute legitimate evidence. So we can do that, you know, with created things like a Volkswagen Beetle, big Volkswagen Beetle, and then next to it you put a sedan and say, well, the Beetle evolved into the bigger sedan. Then next to that you put a limousine. Well, the sedan evolved into this big limousine. Then you put next to that a stretch limousine. Well, it evolved into this bigger stretch limousine, and then you have a bus. So here we have all the transitional evidence, the evolution from the Volkswagen Beetle into a bus. But obviously, these are just different created things that they have put in a series from smaller to larger and tell a story about it when absolutely no evolution took place at all. It's really easy to do that, but it's not legitimate evidence, and yet it dominates in our textbooks. These pictures constitute a method of psychological warfare against our children with the ape men and everything else, trying to, by suggestive illustrations, argue a point that really is not logically defensible. I mean, I could argue that plastic knives evolved into plastic forks. And look here, we've got all the transitions, beautiful transitions. Start out with a fork, it gets a little shorter, a little wider. We have a spoon, and then we have what's called sporks with 3 prongs, and then a spork with 4 prongs, then a long fork with longer prongs, and then a full-size fork with really long prongs. Beautiful series. The evolution must be the answer. This proves it. No, these are created things that somebody has arranged into a series, and you can then tell a story about it, but that's not science. Science would be actually observing it happen and having a credible mechanism explaining why it is happening. This all happened by intelligent design, as did all the fossils, all the life forms that we find as fossils in the fossil record. They were all created, but you can put them in order like this and tell stories. It really constitutes no legitimate proof. Now then, Niles Eldridge of the American Museum of Natural History, he talks about the imaginary stories of, you know, the horse evolution and everything has gotten into textbooks as though it were true. For instance, he says the most famous example on horse evolution, prepared perhaps 50 years ago, that has been presented as literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now he says, now I think that is lamentable, particularly because the people who propose these kinds of stories themselves may be aware of the speculative nature of some of the stuff. But by the time it filters down to the textbooks, we have got science as truth, and we've got a problem. Yeah, so he's not convinced that the horse evolution is all it's cracked up to be, and for good reason. Now, the popularly told here in the Houston Chronicle, the article says the popularly told example of horse evolution suggesting a gradual sequence of changes from 4-toed fox-sized creatures living nearly 50 million years ago, to today's much larger one-toed horse has long been known to be wrong. Instead of gradual change, fossils of each intermediate species appear fully distinct, persist unchanged, and then become extinct. Transitional forms are unknown. But if we get rid of these icons of evolution out of the textbooks, you open up to the section on proof for evolution, it's all blank pages. So even though Niles Eldredge and other evolutionists admit it's really not a proof of evolution, it still remains in the textbooks as a necessity. Now, evolutionists actually believe that since whales are air breathers, that they first evolved as land animals, and then they decided to go into the sea and become marine creatures. Of course, that would cause a horrific transformation in morphology and anatomy that we ought to see tremendous transitional forms for. But unfortunately, of course, we do not. In their desperation, though, they've tried to argue, as this textbook does here, it says many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges. Now, if it was a pelvis, it'd be sure a lot more credible if it actually attached to the vertebral column the way a pelvis is supposed to. And it doesn't look much like a pelvis at all. It doesn't look like a femur, but it does look like designed bones to fulfill an important purpose. And indeed they do. They're not worthless vestiges. They serve as anchor bones for important muscles that aid the whale in the copulation process that's needed for reproduction. I won't go into all the explicit details, but copulating in a marine environment isn't all that easy. And so there has to be a little help there. And these bones there for anchors for that muscle have a very, very important purpose. There's arguably no important purpose in biology than reproduction, because if you can't pass on your genes to your offspring, that's the end of the line. It's extinction. So to say they're useless when we know they have a very good and important and apparently designed purpose, and to call them a pelvis and femur when they don't look that way and they're not connected to the vertebral column is, again, just making up stories. Now, this other biology textbook says much the same thing. Whales have a vestigial pelvis and leg bone that serve no purpose. Well, yes, they do, but they don't want to acknowledge that. These structures are evidence of the whale's evolution from four-legged land-dwelling mammals. Well, that's precious little, to say the least. And since creationists have been pointing this out for many years now, the evolutionists have felt beholden to come up with a better series to make this impossible story seem a little bit more credible to the students. So here we have Phil Gingrich's Pachycetus. Pachycetus means the whale of Pakistan, since its remains are found in Pakistan. Now, notice at the bottom it says Phil Gingrich, who's purportedly one of the most highly touted evolutionist experts in whale evolution. He said, in time and in its morphology, Pachycetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. Well, he made that claim and had this picture drawn on the basis of what we see there on the right. Notice only the stippled segments of the skull is what was actually found. A couple of pieces of skull and a piece of the lower jaw. And from that, they leaped to the conclusion that it was perfectly intermediate between a whale and a land mammal. Now, what happened here is classic. It has happened over and over again when it comes to the alleged ape men. They get some fragmentary evidence because they have to have something concrete before they can start talking about evolution. And even with very fragmentary evidence, they then justify putting on paper in an artist's reconstruction of what they think it looked like, because they know it had to play a major role in evolution. But then, as more fossil evidence comes in, they find a more complete remains of this creature. And we find out that their wild imagination as to how it was to be reconstructed was completely wrong. And that happened as well with Pachycetus. Here we have how it was illustrated on the left. On the top corner on the right there, we see the further fossil remains that were found. And of course, we can see it didn't look like that. It was a fully quadruped land-dwelling mammal. The reconstruction in the lower right, I think, is a legitimate type of reconstruction, and it certainly doesn't look like it's half whale, half mammal. It's an obviously fully committed quadrupedal land animal. But rather than admit that they're wrong and face the shame, the loss of face for making such an obvious mistake, they figured they'll get out of that problem by just saying that this is a terrestrial whale, a land whale. I'm not kidding. Notice it says here, all the postcranial bones indicate that pachycetids were land mammals and indicate that the animals were runners with only their feet touching the ground. The first whales were fully terrestrial and were even efficient runners. Well, if that's a whale, then anything could be a whale. I mean, pigs, wolves, sheep, cattle, elephants, any four-legged land-dwelling mammal can be a whale. But rather than admit they made a mistake, that's obviously not a whale, they just say, we'll call it a terrestrial whale, a land whale. Well, I think it's a whale of a tail, and I think it insults our intelligence for them to do that, to try to save face and to call that a whale when everybody with half a lick of sense can realize it is not. Now here we have Ambulocetus. The name means ambulatory or walking whale, and the reconstruction by Kenneth Miller, well-known evolutionist, it shows a fully land-dwelling quadruped mammal, not anything that's half mammal, half whale. But when they draw the reconstruction, they give these webbed feet to make it look like it's transitioning into a marine creature. Now, the real problem with it is that there's really not enough evidence to make any definitive assertions whatsoever. Notice these dark sections right here and here. Those were found 15 feet higher in a different rock strata than the rest of the bones. So there's really no legitimate proof that they were ever connected to the same creature. By evolutionary standards, they could have been hundreds of thousands of millions of years apart in time, not the same creature. So when we eliminate those dubious examples there's not a whole lot left of Ambulocetus. Certainly not enough to claim that it was half whale and half mammal. There's simply not enough there. It shouldn't be drawing really any reconstructions until they get more complete evidence. But they have to have something, so they draw the picture. Any fragment of bone will do to justify them drawing a picture that looks like evolution, because they want to give that illusion, that psychological impact on the students. Now, when we move down one step to Rhodocetus, there we have what looks like, wow, a really strong argument for a transition. It has a whale's fluke, and it has kind of half fins, half feet. Boy, that looks like a real transition. But as you may have guessed, it's not all so rosy as it looks. It actually is more like what we have up here in the upper right, a fully land-dwelling mammal. Now here we find a quote from Dr. Phil Gingrich, again, this whale evolution expert, and he was interviewed by a creationist for a book and for a video series. And he said, and I quote, "Since then, we have found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arms of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't, that is, does not have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale." So the interviewer said here, you told me that you found the limbs, but I notice in your reconstruction, with the fossil display, you don't have the limbs on the creature. If you found them, why aren't they on the display? You do have this drawing, and the drawing looks transitional the way they want it to look. But he's basically saying, no, it didn't fit. It didn't fit the drawing. It didn't fit our preconceived ideas. And so rather than, again, admitting that they were wrong and putting those limbs out there where everybody can jolly well see it was nothing but a fully quadrupedal land-dwelling mammal. And you call that a terrestrial whale if you want, but you're not kidding anybody. We weren't born yesterday. Instead of putting it out there where you can actually see the fossil evidence, they unconscionably withheld it and just put this picture. Now you notice also the picture has the beginning of a whale's fluke, the up and down undulating type movement that whales and dolphins do. And whenever we see that in the anatomy, there's a kind of a ball joint vertebrae toward the end there. That would argue that, yeah, it had a whale's fluke, but that whole section is missing. There's no evidence of any ball joint there. Therefore, there's no legitimate evidence whatsoever to say it had a whale's fluke other than their evolutionary prejudice. Again, they put evidence there when there's no bones to support it. And when they do have the bones that show it doesn't fit, they refuse to put those on display. So this is the kind of sad chicanery that goes on. And the victims, but for the most part, are students who get this stuff put in their textbooks and it looks so convincing in the photographs, but the actual fossil evidence does not support it at all. So basically we have them calling the Mesonicid and Huyson's land whale, nothing but land-dwelling quadrupeds. Ambulocetus, again, just not enough evidence to say what it was. They shouldn't be drawing anything until they get more evidence. Rhodocetus is a fraud because they found evidence that showed that it should look like these things up at the top, four-legged land-dwelling mammals, not half whale, half land mammal. And then finally, we have Basilosaurus at the bottom. Now, the Basilosaurus has these claspers in the rear there. They say, well, see, those are vestigial legs. Well, again, they don't connect to the vertebral column. They don't need to. They're simply for clasping, not for supporting weight. And again, they appear to have a design purpose because, again, to copulate in a marine environment is not easy. And to hold together, you know, with the sea currents and the waves and all that, you need a little clasping. So it definitely is an important design feature if it's required for copulation, and can't be said to be a useless vestige. But one of the worst parts of the Basilosaurus is that although it's drawn in proportion to the rest of these creatures in the series, in fact, it is 10 times longer than any of them. So they shortened it deliberately to try to make it fit and look like it properly belongs there. But even worse part of that is that it has distinctive features of its anatomy that simply rule it out as being in the family tree of whales. Could not have been an ancestor of whales. And I quote here Barbara Stahl in her book, Vertebrate History, Problems and Evolution. Although she's an evolutionist, she says the serpentine form of the body and the peculiar shape of the teeth make it plain that these archaeocetes, like Basilosaurus, could not possibly have been the ancestor of modern whales. So there are evolutionist experts who disagree. That doesn't belong anywhere in the family tree of whales. It shouldn't be put in the textbooks, but they're desperate to have this series that gives the illusion that whale evolution took place. As hard of a story as it is to swallow, they put in these beautifully drawn pictures and hope the students don't ask, can we really look at all the evidence? Can we see it in proper proportion? Can we see if there's any dissent from other evolutionists? Can we see what the actual bones look like that these drawings are based on? Of course, if they were shown that, it wouldn't be very convincing at all. So there are those who say that whales evolved from wolf-like creatures with paws. Others say they evolved from four-legged land-dwelling ungulates. An ungulate is a hoofed mammal, like a horse or a cow or pigs or sheep or whatever. So here's my story on how the whale evolved. We start with the dairy cow, and the dairy cow, you know, got tired of eating hay and alfalfa, so he decided to browse among the seaweed, eat seaweed. Now and then it would catch an occasional fish. So it spent more and more time in the water. Blind random destructive mutations began to adapt to the new environment. And since it didn't need a tail to bat flies away, its tail turned into a whale's fluke. And then it was easier to swim, so it spent more time in the water. Blind random destructive mutations took their toll. And as a result, we find that the rear legs disappeared. And we find that the horns disappeared. We find the front legs turned into fins. And we find that the nostrils of the cow migrated from the snout of the cow all the way back to the back of the head and became the blowhole of the whale. A lot of big changes happening by blind random destructive mutations, and of course with no transitions to document that it ever did happen in the living world or on the fossil record. But the worst transition here is with the udder. A cow's udder is radically different from a whale's udder. Whales have to nurse underwater, and so they have a specially designed receptacle designed to fit the shape of the snout of the baby whale. So when it puts its snout up in there, it has a watertight seal, and that keeps seawater from getting in and diluting the milk, which could be a big problem. So it has a special valve and receptacle, and that's very crucial, and it's very, very different from the udder of the cow. So I hope you'll pardon the pun, but I think that all of this was a failure, and when it comes to the udder, it was especially an utter failure altogether. Okay. Now then, National Geographic back in 1998, they kind of rushed to judgment. You know, again, another big transition is supposed to be from reptiles to birds. And although they're claiming, you know, they found reptiles now with the feathers and everything, it is very, very debatable. Some of these things I think are birds that have feathers. And one for sure, we see how biased they were in the case of what's been called the Piltdown bird. Piltdown man, that was an obvious fraud that was discovered, back in the 20th century. It was found in 1912. And for 40 years, it reigned supreme in our textbooks and museums, evidence for human evolution. Then later, they looked at it a little more carefully, which they should have done at the beginning, found out it was complete fraud. It was chemically doctored and filed and everything to make it look like half man, half ape. And it was indeed a pure forgery. But it fooled the most brilliant minds of the time because, like the goose that laid the golden egg, it gave them what they wanted. It fit their preconceived ideas, and so they didn't look at it with much of a critical thought until later when it became obvious that it was indeed a fraud. We have a similar case here with Archaeoraptor. It is supposed to be a half bird, half reptile, and it might still be in the museums today if it were not for a Chinese scientist who was honest and willing to blow the whistle. And he basically said, I think they've made a mistake here. The top half of this fossil appears to be a bird, and the bottom half, because there's a crack and a break there, the bottom half belongs to a reptile or dinosaur. And he says, when they split this rock open, it left like a mirror image on each side of the rock. He says, I have the complete mirror image of one side, and it matches perfectly with the top half, perfectly like a fingerprint. It cannot be denied. But it is completely a bird in my image. Their part, the part on top, looks like a bird, but they have glued on a piece that they claim to have found together, but it's been put in there like a jigsaw puzzle piece, and it's part of a dinosaur. So they took a bird and a dinosaur, glued it together, and they're claiming that it is a transitional form when in fact I have the original and it's all nothing but a bird. So that is why it has gotten the dubious distinction of being called Piltdown bird. Well, the problem with this is that they're so desperate to have such evidence, to put it in National Geographic, to put it in the textbooks if they can, that they will manufacture it if they have to. And the sad thing is that they pretty much knew about this and went ahead and put it to press anyway. Notice Lewis M. Simmons writing on the title of Archaeoraptor Fossil Trail, and this was published in National Geographic, where the original picture was published. He said, using what he has assimilated and read, I've assembled a brief history of Archaeoraptor. It's a tale of misguided secrecy and misplaced confidence, of rampant egos clashing, of self-aggrandizement, wishful thinking, naive assumptions, human error, stubbornness, manipulation, backbiting, lying, corruption, and most of all, abysmal communication. It's a story in which none of the characters look good. Well, I think that's a pretty honest assessment. It's so easy for people to forget that scientists are red-blooded, fallen, sinful humanity, just like everything else, and getting a PhD doesn't make them somehow infallible, doesn't make them immune to the human frailties of pride, prejudice, and preconceived ideas. And they're often willing to lie and cheat and put forth doctored specimens if it suits their fancy, if it helps to advance their agenda. Now, I quote here Thomas Kemp, who is still alive, and he is considered one of the premier experts in the mammal-like fossils. The synapsids are considered a type of mammal-like fossil. They're mainly considered mammal-like because their leg and joint anatomy is quite similar to mammals, but of course they were designed by God to operate in a similar environment and to locomote in a similar environment. So of course there would be a lot of design similarities. Similarly, cars, trucks, and buses were intelligently created, designed to operate on paved roads. So they have a lot of design similarities, but that doesn't mean they're related by evolution. Doesn't mean that reptiles evolved into mammals. But even here, this world-class expert admits they really don't have the fossil evidence anyway. He says, of course, there are many gaps in the synapsid fossil record. The intermediate forms between the various known groups almost invariably unknown. He said gaps at a lower taxonomic level, species and genera, are practically universal in the fossil record of the mammal-like reptiles. In no single adequately documented case is it possible to trace a transition species by species from one genus to another. So one of perhaps the world's greatest expert on the mammal-like reptiles says, well, there really isn't any good fossil evidence. That should be in the textbooks. But of course, he can put it in a book or put it in a magazine, but it just doesn't seem to filter down to the textbooks where the students get to hear it. Now, the morphological anatomy of certain reptiles and mammals might be similar, but there's one great big difference between all mammals and reptiles. And that is that in reptiles, you have this one large ear bone we see there in the upper left, the columella, and we have numerous bones in the jaw, whereas I believe mammals have one big jawbone or mandible, but they have three different articulated ear bones that interface in a very precision manner. And it's connected, to the eardrum and the cochlea, that kind of curly organ there. And inside that curly organ, we have an incredibly complex structure, the most complex organ in the inner ear, the organ of Corti, which is unique to mammals. It is unknown in reptiles, and yet it is the main seat of hearing in mammals. Now, the evolutionists are forced to say that somehow some of the jaw bones, since reptiles have more jaw bones than mammals, supposedly they can afford to lose a couple of them. And so some of these unhinged, disarticulated began to shrink down simultaneously. The long bone, the columella of the reptile, shrunk down. They formed this tremendously complex, delicate interface of these three bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or more commonly known as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, because of how they appear and what they do. And that supposedly happened, but we see absolutely no evidence of it in the living world or the fossil record. Furthermore, it's hard to believe, hearing is really important to survival. Such a radical change would take perhaps millions of years, during which, since the ear isn't complete, how are you supposed to hear? You'd be stone cold deaf. Even if you could get those bones to disarticulate and get the columella to shrink down and all of them to interface so precisely, you'd still be stone cold deaf, because the most complex hearing organ in the mammal is the organ of Corti, which is completely absent in the reptiles. And we can ask the question, why would this even be necessary? Reptiles are supposed to have been surviving fine for many millions of years, evolved before mammals, are still here today. Why do they need such a radical change in their hearing if they can survive all this time without it? And what would be the consequence of this change? How can the reptile use his jaw very well when bones are being pulled out of it and turned into ear bones? And how can he survive when he can't even hear predators coming, can't hear his prey? That would be a very big detriment, and yet his ear won't be ready for millions of years for such a big transformation as this. And that organ of Corti, which is so marvelously complex, be the last thing you'd expect to evolve. Even if you got these other three ear bones, you'd still be stone cold deaf without the organ of Corti. And yet it would take millions of years even on its own because of its complexity, according to them. So all this time you have to make do with jaws that don't work very well and ears that don't work at all. And there's no evidence, living or fossil, that it ever happened. It appears they were separately created with these different type of ear systems, and never the twain shall meet. Now, Darwin himself, in his famous book on the origin of species, he admitted that long before the reader has arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to him. Some of them are so serious that to this day, I can hardly reflect on them without being in some degree staggered. Why, if species have descended from other species by fine graduation, do not we everywhere see innumerable transitional forms, right? We should see it today in the living world and in the fossil record, but we don't see them. Then he said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum or rock layer full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this is perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So he admitted this is evidence against his theory. It's serious. It's a deal breaker, a game breaker. If you can't find the transitions, you got to throw in the towel. But he had great hope that with increased discovery of the fossil record, increased digging and discoveries in the field of paleontology, all these many myriads of missing links would show up. But as we've seen, that's not the case at all. In fact, it's only gotten worse since Darwin's time. I quote here Dr. David Raup of the Chicago Field Museum, an evolutionist paleontologist. He said, well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin. He actually wrote this in 1979. We're actually 164 years since Darwin wrote his book. And knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Remember, Darwin had to throw in the towel if it didn't get better. He pleaded for time, but he's had more than ample time, and knowledge of the fossil record has increased more than 100-fold. So by now, it's either, do or die. If they don't have it by now, the theory is simply disproven. He said, by this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Now, here we have a personal letter from Dr. Colin Patterson, a former senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, written to creationist Mr. Luther Sunderland. And Sunderland read his book on evolution. Again, Dr. Patterson was a paleontologist and expert in fossils, wrote a book on evolution. That was the title of his book. But he didn't give a single example, even a drawing or a photograph of a transitional form, fossil or living. And so Sutherland said, hey, I've read your book and you don't have a single example of transition. Why not? And he wrote back and said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustrations of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. But Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Well, there should be thousands upon thousands in every museum in the world. If evolution were true, they should be as common as could be. Yet there's only a handful that they really argue about, and those handful are so disputed by other evolutionists, such as Dr. Colin Patterson, that they don't accept them. I mean, a handful of questionable examples doesn't cut the mustard. When there should be thousands upon thousands everywhere, it amounts to as good a disproof as you can get from the fossil record. Now, Mark Ridley in New Scientist, he said, the gradual change of fossil species has never been part of the evidence for evolution. Darwin showed that the record was useless for testing between evolution and special creation because it has great gaps in it. Wrong, 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 false, false, false. Yes, it's useless for proving evolution because it needs the transitions and they do not have them. Even after 164 years, they don't have them. We don't see them in the living world. We don't see them in the fossil record. That means we can test between creation and evolution. I mean, what better proof would there be if creation took place? What would you expect to see? What would you predict to see? Exactly what we see in the fossil record. So gaps are predicted and are a positive evidence for creation. They're only evidence against evolution. He's trying to say, well, it's useless either way. No, no, no. It's useless for evolution. It's against evolution, but it's very useful for us. It fits our prediction. It's what you'd expect to see scientifically if creation took place, and it is exactly what we do see. So he says, and I quote, the same argument applies. In any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist is what that should say, which means slow, jerky evolution, stasis punctuated by rapid change, would be the punctuated equilibrium theory. He says they don't use the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Well, yeah, but we use it as evidence against evolution because it fits our prediction and it fatally contradicts their prediction. Now, the creationists have pointed this out for so many years that they've now gone to the absurd extreme of saying that same old argument, well, Your Honor, we don't have any evidence, but we have this theory as to why the evidence doesn't exist. Is that good enough that we have a dandy theory to explain why the evidence doesn't exist? No, doesn't matter how many theories you have. If you're admitting the evidence doesn't exist, then you simply have no case. All the theories in the world amount to nothing in a court of law. If you can't provide real evidence, theories mean nothing. And they're just saying, well, we have a theory that evolution happened in just the right way, that it didn't leave any evidence. Well, what a dandy theory. You know, the one thing is supposed to prove that it's true, it doesn't happen. It's like that example I used of the guy who supposedly was the criminal genius and committed a crime in just the right way that he didn't leave any incriminating evidence. Therefore, that proves he committed the crime. No, it proves that there's no evidence that he committed the crime. That's what it proves. It would be all that counts in the court of law or in science too. So the hopeful monster theory was first proposed by Richard B. Goldsmith clear back in the 40s. And he said, we have these big gaps in the fossil record because rapid evolution, rapid saltations, rapid changes took place, macro mutations or whatever. And the reason there's a big gap between reptiles and birds was because the first bird came from a mutated reptile's egg, and when it hatched, a fully feathered flying bird with all its unique lung system, beaks, everything else, it came out of that egg. Well, that's a little hard to explain, because whether mutations are happening rapidly or slowly, there's still random destructive processes. They wouldn't be able to produce something more complex than a reptile, much less better. And when you think about it, this would be an extremely rare thing. Maybe once every several thousand years, if even that. Where's it going to find a mate to reproduce? If it can't reproduce, it's going to go extinct. And it has to be a member of the opposite sex for it to reproduce. What if it finds another hopeful monster, but it's the same sex? It can't reproduce. I mean, it just shows the absurdity of it. And most evolutionists agree that the hopeful monster theory is a bit too much. But they've tried to modify it and change it into the punctuated equilibrium theory. In other words, they say that evolution is like the life of a soldier, full of long periods of boredom, punctuated by rapid onsets of terror and catastrophe and battle. Well, as they claim, everything seems to be in stasis and then is punctuated by rapid change. And they formulate it again in such a way that it happens in just the right way that you can't really expect it to leave much of anything in the way of evidence. So we predict the lack of evidence, but it does happen in such a way that there might now and then be a little bit of evidence produced. So if we find anything, we'll claim it. But for the most part, we'll claim that, it's not unusual to find no evidence because it happens in just the right way. It doesn't leave any evidence. Again, the same old argument that would never hold up in a court of law. So here we have S.M. Stanley, this evolutionist, writing in his work, Macroevolution, Pattern and Process. He says, established species are evolving so slowly that major transitions between genera and higher taxa must be occurring within small, rapidly evolving populations that leave no legible fossil record. How convenient. We can't see it today because it happens so slow, they claim. We can't see it in the fossil record because it happens in small, rapidly evolving populations that are so rapid they just don't leave any legible fossil record. So when you pin them down to where's the definitive evidence that evolution really has happened, we don't observe it today, we don't observe it in the fossil record, it jolly well happens because they jolly well want it to happen. That's basically what it boils down to. We're the majority, and the majority of scientists believe in evolution, and the majority of experts believe in evolution. Therefore, it must be true. But those are both textbook examples of logical fallacies that do not logically prove anything. Since when does the majority decide what is truth? If you get 49% of the people versus 51% of the people, are the 51% automatically right because they're the majority? It should be facts, evidence, and logic that determine truth, not counting noses. And to appeal to authority, which is a classic textbook fallacy, argumentum ad authoritarium. In other words, let's appeal to the authorities. What the authorities say must be true. But that doesn't take into account that all authorities are humans who are flawed, who are frail, who have bias and prejudice, preconceived ideas, who often will lie and cheat and steal if it suits them and is going to further their specific agenda. History is full of that. And we see in the history of science, many times scientists have lied and cheated. In fact, publishing false research is a major problem nowadays. High percentage of the research that's published, they say is false, but to prove it, you'd have to go through all that research yourself to spend a lot of money. So it's kind of a catch-22. So to say that they have the majority and that the experts say so is not a logical argument. Where's the facts, the evidence, and the logic? That determines what's truth, and they simply don't have that. Now then, I like what Paul Feyerabend said. He said, scientists develop and adhere to theories for what are ultimately subjective and even irrational reasons, quote unquote, and that modern scientists can be every bit the equal of ancient myth tellers, troubadours, and court jesters. When they advocate theories that predict the lack of evidence and say you have to believe it even though there is no evidence because we tell you so and we're the experts, they're indulging in, la-la land fantasy. Now, there are three major strikes against evolution right from the get-go. Strike number one is that Darwinian evolution, by definition, is impossible to observe. By definition, it supposedly took millions of years, and yet science and facts of science are based on repeated experimentation and observation, preferably under controlled conditions in a laboratory. But if you can't repeat it and observe it, it's not testable, it's not scientific, and nobody can set up an experiment that lasts for millions of years. no matter how many fatal flaws we have with Darwinism, they always say, yeah, but if you had millions of years, all those problems would disappear. It's only an illusion of impossibility. If you had the millions of years, it would happen. But then there's no way to test that. There's no way to prove that. It's just an assertion without any possible means of testing, and therefore it's inherently not scientific. It's not a scientifically testable theory. It's just a belief system. It's a hypothesis that can't be tested. Strike number two, the mutation selection mechanism, even Stephen Gould admitted, was effectively dead. It's not credible that random changes in any information system will make it better. We can prove it degrades the information rather quickly. The more you accumulate, the worse it gets. And natural selection can't change that because it can only select what the random mutations produce. And since they don't produce new and better information, but rather degrade and destroy the information, the natural selection can't save that problem. So he said we need to find something better, but he never did before he died in 2002. And third strike, as Dr. Colin Patterson pointed out, there's not a single watertight transitional fossil known. There's only several that they'll even argue about, and they're even questioned amongst the evolutionist community, so it's not very convincing. A handful of disputable forms doesn't cut the mustard when there should be thousands upon thousands, boatloads in every museum. Darwin said so. He said, give me time, you'll get them. Well, there's more than ample time. It's not there. And that's the end of the story. It has failed to materialize. So when we look at the evolutionary tree of life, we see that it supposedly started from the seed of the tree. A tree can't come from nothing. It comes from a seed, and they say, oh, we got that all worked out. It was the first cell. The first cell was the first species, and from that seed grew and evolved all the other species we find in the living world, both the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom. It all came from that seed. The problem is, of course, that we can't account for that seed scientifically. Based on what we know, not what we don't know, it appears to be mathematically, chemically, physically, thermodynamically impossible, and no experiment has even gotten close. The worst problem with the origin of life is that no matter what kind of chemical environment you start with, and you use any kind of raw energy you want, radiation, electricity, earthquakes, volcanism, whatever you want to use, if it produces any compounds at all, they're grossly mixed up with non-biological toxic lethal compounds. So they're grossly contaminated. They say, oh, we find living types of compounds that are found in life in meteors. They never point out the fact that the vast majority of them are non-biological, toxic, lethal chemicals. We have very just traces of the kinds we need. And if the vast preponderance is the wrong kind, probabilistically, it's impossible. And they bond with one another to form non-biological compounds that can't work. So they've never been able to produce any experiment where they produce adequate quantity and purity of the compounds that you need. And then even if you had all of them adequately, quantitatively, and pure, they'll still cross-react the wrong way. Some of them, like ribose sugar, break down within a few days. You need millions of years for it to evolve, but they disappear in a few days. The others will break down relatively rapidly by hydrolysis and thermodynamics. And you can't keep these things from cross-reacting, and they cross-react in ways that prohibit rather than promote the origin of life. So theoretically, mathematically, chemically, physically, experimentally, it has failed miserably. So we cannot account for the seed. That's the first fatal flaw. Right on the heels of that, we find that other big flaw, that the trunk of the tree is simply not there, because from the cell, the seed of the tree is supposed to produce all these other things, but it starts out with this huge gap with nothing there. And there's where the biggest evolution supposedly took place in the history of evolution, there's absolutely nothing there. Impossible to believe, impossible to swallow. You know, I wasn't born yesterday, and I'm not going to swallow this bunch of gobbledygook just because the experts say so. No, you have to be more than an expert. You actually have to have facts, evidence, and logic, like in a court of law. You can't say, oh, I got my degree from Harvard, so whatever I say is true. Well, no, the defendant has the videotapes, all the eyewitnesses, all the forensic evidence. You have nothing but your law degree from Harvard. Yeah, we agree you're an expert from Harvard, but that doesn't mean you have the evidence, and that's what decides the case. Not the majority, not who has the best credentials, but who actually has the facts, the evidence, and the logic. So we have no seed, we have no trunk. That right there destroys the theory. There are two fatal flaws, never been solved. And until they are, the theory is simply not credible. I tell them, come back when you've solved these two fatal flaws. How many fatal flaws does any theory have to have before I no longer have to listen to it? just one will do, but here we have two. And since your theory is fatally flawed, I don't want to talk about all this other alleged evolution. It can't be true as long as these fatal flaws remain. You fix the fatal flaws, then come back, and you've earned the right, by fixing those fatal flaws, you've earned the right to talk about something else. But I don't have to talk about any theory that has two fatal flaws, and this has them right at the beginning. So come back later when you have it. Well, you know, they'll never come back because they've never been able to fix these flaws. The evidence is not there in either case. So to use an analogy, say I'm walking with my evolutionist friend. He says, why don't you believe in evolution? I say, well, it's just too hard for me to believe. Too many evidence and facts against it and not enough evidence for it. Then we see this fellow lying prostrate on the ground. I notice he's wearing a t-shirt, and the t-shirt says on it, I am Mr. Evolution. I said, oh, Mr. Evolution's there on the ground. Let's check it out. And I said, oh my, I'm sorry. I think Mr. Evolution is dead. And my evolutionist friend says, no, he can't be dead. I believe in evolution. He's got to live. And I said, well, I think he's dead because you'll notice there's a stake right through his heart. And that's usually fatal. In fact, it always is. And he says, oh, that's nitpicky. The stake has only destroyed his heart. It hasn't touched any of the other organs of his body. Let's just give him CPR. He'll be fine. That is what you call delusion. Now, the Bible actually says that God himself will send a strong delusion upon those who utterly reject the truth, who love not the truth, but have their pleasure in unrighteousness. And God will send them a strong delusion so they'll believe the lie they want to believe. And such people you cannot argue with because they will not listen to facts, evidence, and logic. They will believe what they want to believe, just like this guy says, we'll give him CPR, he'll be fine. It's delusional. It's not dealing with reality. Then I said, well, there's even another problem here. I notice that his head is severed from his shoulders, and there's a big gap where his neck should be. So his head is severed, his neck is gone. We have no idea where it is. But when your head is severed and the neck is missing, that's a fatal gap. And so not only does he have this stake through the heart, we can't explain the origin of the first cell, he has this fatal gap like we have with the Eocambrian problem. Huge gap between single cells and multi-million cell creatures, never been filled. So he says, no. The neck must be somewhere. In the meantime, we'll give him CPR, he'll be fine. You know, if somebody actually did that, they'd end up being thrown in an insane asylum, but the evolutionists do essentially the same thing. Look at impossible, fatal flaws and just say, oh, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. No, I don't think so. What about the rest of the fossil record? Well, I'll quote the eminent paleontologist Stephen Gould about the rest of the fossil record. He says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, in other words, wishful thinking, belief, based on the assumption evolution is true in the first place. He says, however reasonable that inference may be, it is not the evidence of fossils. In other words, it's not admissible. You can have all the inference and assumptions you want, but in a court of law and in science, you have to have the hard facts, and he admits it's not there. So according to no less an expert than him, we have no connecting branches. You have to ask yourself the question, what kind of tree has no seed to grow from, no trunk to support it, and not even any connecting branches? A wannabe tree, a non-existent tree, a fairy tale tree, but certainly not a scientific tree. What we see at the tips and the nodes of the branches, of course, are complete forms, beautifully engineered, beautifully created, no transitions between them. Exactly what biblical creation predicts you would see in the living world today and in the fossil record is exactly what we do see. What better evidence could there be that creation took place and not evolution? And worse yet, of course, is that we now find that these fossils, even clear down in the Cambrian, have soft tissue and proteins still intact, which thermodynamically is impossible and is also impossible because ground radiation, although mild, would have erased all of that easily within a few 100,000 years. So not only do we not have the evidence of transitions, but we have the evidence the fossils themselves can only be several thousand years old, dating back to the time of the flood, and therefore there is simply no time for evolution either. The conclusion is, of course, that the fossil record confirms creation, as would be expected, because God's word is true. Amen. Okay, so let's see if we can get this back up here now. Hope you've been able to hear all this time.
Very good.
Yeah, you were able to hear me? I didn't hear any feedback.
Oh
I
yeah,
know
no, we had everybody muted and we could hear you fine.
Okay, good, good. All right, and you can see me all right then?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good.
Go
Well, I
ahead
guess we
and
can.
unshare your screen for a moment.
Okay, let me get it here. Stop the share. There we go. All right.
So
Yeah.
we're going to transition. Now, this is an actual transition, none like the fake ones that we've been hearing about.
Yeah, an actual transition. Okay, that's
And
all right.
we're going to go to a short Bible study that I'm going to give you. And then we're going to go to questions and answers. And it is a little late, but we'll get a few questions and answers, and then we'll close in prayer. And then we'll stop the recording. So let me go to share screen, and I will bring up a little Bible study I want to show you. Now, this is a little kind of a word study on the word wisdom in the Bible. And I kind of just stumbled onto it. And I kept hearing about wisdom and that it's another term that the Bible uses for the Messiah. And that I kept bumping into it and bumping into it. I says, okay, I've got to compile this and share it because it's a little too good to keep to myself. So here we go. Father, bless this little Bible study in Jesus' name. Amen. 1 Corinthians 1:24, and again, you could cross-reference this with Proverbs 8, where you see the writer of Proverbs, I believe it's Solomon, speaking of wisdom as a personification in the female form. The reason that they use female to describe wisdom is because in foreign languages, unlike English, like Spanish and Latin and Greek and Hebrew, nouns are given a gender and it's arbitrary. And in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and Spanish, the word for wisdom is in the feminine gender. So you would always say, if you're speaking of wisdom as a noun, as a personification, you would say she. You wouldn't say he. But nevertheless, wisdom is also referred to as the Messiah. Let me show you. 1 Corinthians 1:24, Paul refers to wisdom as the wisdom of God, Christ as the wisdom of God when he says, but to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, in the apocryphal writings that the Jews put together, most likely in Alexandria, Egypt, in the Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon was a Jewish writing for Jews to be faithful in a foreign land. And it was sent and given out for Jews to be faithful. And one of the passages in the Wisdom of Solomon was referred to by the author of Hebrews. Let's read the Wisdom of Solomon first. It says in 7:26 of the Wisdom of Solomon, for she, meaning wisdom, for she is the reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God and an image of his goodness. Now, if you're familiar with Hebrews, you remember that there's a very similar verse that sounds a lot like that verse in Wisdom of Solomon. It's Hebrews 1:3, which says, he, meaning Christ, he is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So the word for radiance in Hebrews, and the word for reflection in the Wisdom of Solomon is the same exact word. It's apagasma. And apagasma is only used in those two Greek passages and nowhere else in all the Jewish Greek writings in the Second Temple period do you have that word being used. It's only used in the Apocryphal Book of Wisdom and Hebrews 1. And so it appears that the writer of Hebrews refers back to that verse, and you can see that they do sound quite a bit the same. And also you notice here in Wisdom, it says, she is a spotless mirror of the working of God and an image of his goodness. And it reminds me, that word goodness kind of stood out to me in Exodus 33, 18 and 19, the first part of 19. It says, then Moses said, this is the burning bush scenario, I pray that you show me your glory. I take that back. It wasn't when he showed me. This is the 10 Commandments scenario. Sorry. I pray, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you and proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And so the Lord descended and proclaimed the name of the Lord. But that is described in the verse 18 as when the goodness passed by. Now you go back up to Wisdom and look what he says. That wisdom is an image of his goodness. So it kind of fits with that Old Testament understanding of the pre-incarnate Messiah, the pre-incarnate Christ. Now let's also go to a parallel passage speaking about wisdom, where Luke in 11, was there somebody who has a question? I thought I heard something. That's okay. Luke 11:49 says, this is again a parallel passage with Matthew. Jesus speaking, he just got through rebuking the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and he called them, woe unto you, woe unto you, woe unto you, you're hypocrites, you're vipers, you're terrible, you do all these things. And then he says this verse, and then he starts to say, and because of all this, you will be judged for the blood of all the prophets, starting from Abel and ending with Zechariah, like the first and last prominent person in the scriptures, the older scriptures. So here's what the verse says. For this reason also, Jesus is talking, it says, the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some they will persecute. And Matthew, paralleling it, says, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. But do you see how it says, Christ says, for this reason also the wisdom of God said, but then in Matthew it says, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets. Now, in the Diatessaron, which is an early harmony of the Gospels by Tatian, an early Christian, it was written about 160 AD. Listen to how he translates it. Remember, he is harmonizing Luke and Matthew into a single verse. And this is how he does it. Therefore, behold, I, the wisdom of God, and am sending you prophets and apostles, and and he goes on with the rest of the verse. So he mixes Luke's the wisdom of God said with Matthew's behold, I am sending, and he creates in a harmonization to get one verse out of those two. He says, therefore, behold, I, the wisdom of God, am sending you, unto you prophets. Anyway, I just thought that was really fascinating to see how the wisdom of God is the Messiah. And of course, it really anchors on 1 Corinthians 1:24, where Paul calls Christ the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So that's my little Bible study. It was just something to help you to see some references to the biblical texts, some harmonizations of early Christians by the text, about the text, and how they all kind of intertwine and relate to one another. Multiple passages coming together to give a common understanding that Christ is the wisdom of God. So thank you for that, spending time with me on that little Bible study. And let's open it up for questions and answers, both to Dr. Kindell, and if you have any questions about my little Bible study. I'm going to stop sharing, and you got Dr. Kindell there for questions and answers. Yes, go ahead. Talk to me, and or you can come here either way. I'll relay it in just a second. Okay, let me kind of restate it and ask Dr. Kindell about that. In the Bible, it speaks of angels coming down and interbreeding with humans, and possibly maybe even interbreeding with animals. What is your take on that, Dr. Kindell? And does that specifically relate to evolution, or is it something else?
Well, I don't think that would have anything to do with Darwin's theory of evolution. That would be, supernatural beings, aliens, or not aliens, but fallen spiritual beings or angels, cohabiting with women and having offspring. And there are various theories in that regard. A lot of the ancient Jewish scholars believe that actually did happen. Some of the more modern scholars said, well, the B'nai Elohim, which is in Hebrew, the sons of God, also refers not just to angels, but to humans. The Israelites referred to as sons of the living God in the scripture. So the different theories are that angels cohabited with women, and their offspring were giants, Nephilim, kind of hybrid angel man type creatures. The other is that it was the sons of God, the righteous men of that day, just like the Israelites were righteous when they had their faith in Jehovah the way they're supposed to. They saw these women who enticed them, and they got taken off, with these ungodly women. They had offspring that were famous, that were renowned, and they drew them off so that by the time of the flood, only Noah and his family were the righteous ones left on the earth. So I don't know. I personally, I could see the arguments going both ways. My personal view is that because the Bible specifically says that created kinds are only supposed to reproduce after created kinds, that angels and men could not have produced offspring any more than apes and men could produce offspring. I guess Stalin actually tried that, impregnating women with ape semen, and they all died. It's just there's a barrier there between different created kinds. And the Bible specifically says that Christ did not take on the form of angels, but of the seed of Abraham, Abraham being a human. So it's very distinct that angels and humans are different types in the creative order. Furthermore, it doesn't anywhere tell us that angels have the power of procreation the way humans do. God just created them, like he created all, anything, the stars, anything else. Just let it be, and there was. Let there be myriads of angels, and there were. We like to interpret the Old Testament in light of the New. In the New Testament, Jesus said that in our redeemed state, we would be like the angels who neither marry nor are given in marriage. And so, if angels weren't meant to marry or given marriage or procreate, why would they even have procreative organs, And even if they did, how could they procreate with something of a different created order, since the Bible specifically says that Christ did not take on the form of angels, which was different, but of the form of a human, Abraham, the seed of Abraham. So I tend to go more with the possibility that angels may have been involved, certainly with all the corruption and sin going on back then. They are highly intelligent, supernaturally intelligent, and they were wanting to kill, steal, and destroy, which Jesus said Satan came to kill and steal and destroy. I've come to give you life, not more abundantly. So it might be that the fallen angels were controlling sinful men and women and have kind of doing a breeding experiment where they're breeding people who had genes for giantism, and thus they would be the men of renown. Obviously, there were some genes in the human gene pool for giantism, because we have so many stories of giants even appearing after the flood. In fact, they said the Nephilim were there after the flood in Canaan, in the Promised Land, and they were indeed giants. But you can imagine if you had a breeding program with giant men and giant women breeding and having offspring that were bigger and bigger giants, and if they were demon possessed, being controlled by fallen angels, that would be a powerful way to take over the world, and could have contributed to the world being so corrupt that God had to send the flood. So that's my own personal take on it. For what it's worth, that's my preferred interpretation of that.
Right. Now, I also recall that is the interpretation written in Henry Morris's study Bible. That was his personal take as well.
Was that right? Okay.
That's
Okay.
ICR's
I guess
position.
I'm in good company then. Maybe I read that years ago and it contributed my thoughts on that. So
Maybe so. The angels did not have sex with women according to this interpretation. However, they possessed specific men, obviously choosing the men of the biggest size to breed, like you say, demon possessed, so to speak, breed with the largest of women, and the down the range, you would just get the biggest possible.
Well, yeah, the offspring would be of renown for sure, and would be
Right.
called the Nephilim because they were giants.
Right. Now, interestingly, we have had about 2 different speakers talk on this subject recently, and the last one gave a broad spectrum of all the different positions and didn't take a position. He just gave all the positions to let us choose. So, and we've had others that choose a position. So you're not outside what we've heard already.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear I'm not abnormal.
Oh, wait, I think Corey has a question.
The way I look at the fossil record is the Polaroid picture of no transitional forms that God just provided for us, so we could see no transitional forms.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, the physical record there agrees explicitly with the living world. And, if God created, if Genesis is literal history, what would you expect to see in the living world and in the fossil record? Exactly what we see. So there's simply no evidence for evolution. As Mark Ridley pointed out, any knowledgeable evolutionist wouldn't even try to use the fossil record as evidence for evolution.
Right.
But the textbooks do. The textbooks claim without any evidence, every fossil is a proof of Darwin's theory is true, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to understand that, how to explain that is simply not true. The fact that fossils exist doesn't prove evolution took place. If they were created, then they were created. And if evolution took place, the transition should prove it. But they are there.
We have another question.
Well, comment question type. If I research the Egyptian pyramids, there are hieroglyphs of giants that are about 15 feet tall. And you'll see in their hieroglyphs, normal-sized humans serving them. And when you look, it looks like a giant sitting on a throne, and then a little person doing this. Those
Right.
were Nephilim, mixed hybrid humans that built those pyramids. And in the water, you can see the erosion on the rocks. So my thing was, I don't believe in evolution. I believe in a manipulated form of creation through Satan. So in a way, I'm not going to deter God's creation, but I do believe that Satan manipulates everything. That he distorts what God created to try to say, no, this is not the way it was done. It was done another way.
Right.
Darwin and his theory is amazing because when I was taking classes to take it, because I was wanting to learn some stuff, there are so many holes in the Precambrian, Cambrian, all the different stages.
Oh, yeah.
They just tell me it was a public system that I just went through for 1 year in a class, and they said, either you believe this or you don't pass.
Yeah.
There were so many gaps in there, and I simply told them I'm always raised a Christian, and I believe this, but the teachers simply told me, instructor, you're either going to follow the class in the book, and or you're going to fail. And one of the other teachers, she was Catholic, and she says, just do the work if you want the credit, or else you're going to fail. But she instructed me that it wasn't really a comment, but she instructed me, either you follow the work the way it's done, or you're going to fail. And then there were just so many holes that you couldn't answer to me. So many.
Right.
I asked this question, and asked this question. So this is really interesting when you all this is presented, how we went from fish with legs and so many holes in Darwin's theory. And one more thing, Darwin, if you study, was a Freemason, and Freemason's ideology is to prove that there was no creator. So he's going to come up with a manipulated form of creationism with the not the hypothesis, but the theory of this is the way things came out to be. And so many people so sad that they believe we came from monkeys. And this class is, I mean, and to understand we didn't. Everything you present and you show, it makes me think to myself, you have to wear a cap with a cone on it, because
Yeah.
to believe what you're presented and think, I'm like, some of you look like and act like you did come from monkeys. But the reality is that you must be a weak-minded, unthinking human that's not saved, or that doesn't have the knowledge of the Lord, to believe where you actually say they say you came from. It's a plethora of lies. It's there's so many gaps and holes, and like creation of it is a faith, but it's just so, or the Lord made creation one way, Satan came in and distorted that through the Nephilim, like you say, through giant Egyptians that were like 15 foot tall that did all this stuff. And like I said, I don't believe in creation. I know they found skeletons that were 15 feet big in Egypt.
Let's let him make a
Oh,
comment.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead, and he's made a statement, and I'd like to hear your comment on any thoughts that you have about what he just said.
Well, as far as the hieroglyphics and other artwork depicting giant Egyptians, that actually confirms the biblical account. I think there's actually one part in the Bible where it says that one of the heroes of Israel actually slew a giant Egyptian. So that, again, would confirm the history of the Bible. And I think there's all kinds of evidence of giants in the past. It used to be commonly reported, but once Darwin's theory came to sway, it was not seen to be good, because it seemed to give validity to the history of the Bible and not to evolution, because we're supposed to have evolved from these little 3.5 foot tall Australopithecines up to modern men who are nearly 6 feet tall on the average. And to have men much bigger and live longer, like the Bible says they did in the past, it seems that we have de-evolved or degenerated over time, which is actually what the Bible says. And so it is, evidence that disagrees with Darwinism is squelched and censored. And if you ask questions, you're persecuted. And if you disagree, you're going to fail the course, so they basically, they use a fallacy of logic called argumentum ad baculum, and that's an argument addressed to the club. In other words, we don't have to answer your questions. We can't answer your questions, but if you don't do what we say, we're going to beat you over the head with this club, and that is that you're going to fail the course, you're not going to get your degree, and we're going to call you an idiot, and everybody else will think you're an idiot because you don't agree with us, which really doesn't answer the questions that you're asking. It just, they're using force, and the force of the club or the baculum to beat you into submission. So yeah, it's a big problem that we have in that regard. Now, did we have another question here? Yes.
Ronald, something I'd like to see, Doctor, more of is the idea of the symphony of mutations that would have had to take place in evolving any creature, like the bird, because you're not just evolving the wings, you're evolving the bone structure. And you mentioned the respiratory structure of the birds, the continuous flow, also the neurological system that is required for the very difficult process of flight. But in all these are undirected, without goal or purpose, evolving all at the same time. It's just something I think that should be brought more to the attention of people. I don't hear this much.
Yeah, it should. I remember years ago, I spoke at, I believe it was the University of Oregon on creation. And a young lady in the audience just had a hissy fit that I do not believe in evolution. And the following day, she came and confronted me at the office there where the head of, I believe, Campus Crusade for Christ was there. And she said, well, I can see how this and that could happen. I can visualize that. I can see that. And I said, well, yes, you can, because you're an intelligent person. You have wisdom and knowledge, and you can see and you're consciously aware. But the process you're attributing all these abilities to is blind and unconscious, has no reasonability, can't foresee, a goal. It's unconscious, not even aware anything needs to be attained. Now, with those limitations, how well can it be done? And I can see it struck her that she hadn't really thought about that. It's not what we can see or envision. It's something that's blind, mindless, and unconscious that doesn't know anything about anything. How can it do anything?
Yeah,
and that's what they're stuck with.
And I've noticed oftentimes when you bring these things up, they say, well, it evolved for this purpose. But I say,
it's a purposeless mechanism. It has no purpose in mind.
But that doesn't explain how it happened.
Right.
It explains why you would have designed it that way.
Yeah, it explains why design would make sense. It doesn't explain why random unconscious actions, mutations, or anything would make any sense to achieve any kind of a goal or necessity. There's no consciousness of anything being needed in that type of a mechanism.
I agree. By the way, I just want to comment. On the sons of God, I have always just assumed that it was the descendants of Adam, the righteous descendants of Adam, mixing with the ungodly descendants of Cain. Just logical because of the things you said. I was just.
I think
so Garth is wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think to this day that still is the most popular interpretation of it, and it's an interpretation I tend to agree with myself. Yeah.
It's the Occam's razor view.
Yeah, the simplest explanation is often the best. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Very good. Well, really appreciate you coming out and sharing with us again. We got to have you again. I mean, it would be nice to have you more than once a year, but we definitely want to have you at least by next year at the same time. Yeah, if you're available earlier, let me know and we'll plug you in. We have the entire new year. The slate is clean from January on. So if you got any month you're free, either to be here or by Zoom, let me know.
Okay. Possibly February might work for me.
Okay. All right.
If you let me do one of my biomimetics, my latest one.
We'll give a little plug on that. What's that about?
Well, it's
you wrote a book. You wrote a book.
Well, I've done 6 different video presentations on biomimetics or biomimicry, so I guess it's a book worth of material.
Okay, I got you.
But I didn't actually write a book on it.
You wrote a book on it. Oh, okay.
Oh, no, I didn't.
But a video series, though.
6 video series on it, and the 6th one is the most recent one, which I don't believe I have presented for South Bay. And I don't think I've done number 5 either, but 6 is more up to date in my mind, so it'd be the one I'd prefer to do before I do 5. But they're fascinating examples of, copying design first seen in the world of biology. And there's basically 2 different forms of biomimicry. One is inadvertent, where because we are made in the image of God and we have creative capacities, we can we can invent stories and novels that have never been seen or read before because we have this inventive genius. We can create works of art and sculpture that have never been seen before. We can invent machines that have never been seen or heard of before because as being gifted by God, being made in his image, we are like finite miniature creators, whereas he is the eternal, infinite, omnipotent creator. He was created ever to create things from things that didn't exist, whereas we just manipulate what God created, to make our creations. But we do tend to rethink his thoughts, much like Johannes Kepler said, in science, we're trying to rethink God's thoughts after him. And in inventing all kinds of things, we think, wow, we invented this, we invented that. And then you look at the world of biology and go, oh, somebody already had that invention. Somebody already patented that. Somebody already came up with that idea because we find it embedded in the world of biology. And if it took our intelligence to rethink it and reinvent it, whose intelligence did it take to put it there in the first place? Obviously God, and he deserves the glory for that. The second form of biomimicry or biomimetics is the more pure form, where you deliberately look at the world of biology, trying to find certain design innovations and technology and certain concepts of dealing with certain problems that we can augment and kind of draw inspiration from to solve many of our own problems or just to improve our own technology and our own efficiency in many of our own inventions and machines that we already have. And we find that, well, he did it better using this technique or this design. We can augment that and improve our own technology that way. And that's more pure form of biomimetics, where you deliberately are looking for what we can gain, what we can copy, what we can use to improve our own technology. So I'll be looking at both forms of biomimicry in the presentation.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, I will look forward to that. Yeah, and hey, let's just pencil you in right now. That sounds great.
Okay, well, February out of work. Was it the third Saturday in February?
The fourth Saturday.
I'll put it on my calendar then.
All right, all right. Any other last questions? And online, any other questions? Hit the chat box or unmute yourself. And let me check the chat box. I don't think there's any on. No, we're good. Yeah. Okay.
This
Okay,
is
there you
Betty
go.
Jo. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Kindell, for your excellent presentation and super interesting and
Thank you.
very, very interesting. And of course, the Bible study was awesome too. So
Yes.
those
Yes. Thank you.
presentations were awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, very good. Let's get our treasurer, Ryan Lofton, to close us in a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, oh God, I thank you for creating us. Thank you for creating us on the sixth day and giving us your wisdom, Lord. Just ask you to fill us all with your wisdom as we use this information to witness and bring people to Christ, to you, Lord. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Kindell.
You are very welcome, Garth. Always a pleasure.
Hold on just a second. Okay. Yeah, real quick, for those of you who are online, if you go to the chat box and you can see my address if you scroll up. And if you did want to give a donation, you can mail it to that address. That is the official address for South Bay Creation Science Association. And I will forward that to my treasurer. And again, we do have a few expenses. Our speakers, we give a honorarium to, and our new expenses for the Zoom meetings are going to increase now. We're going to have to start taking that on ourselves. So just to kind of keep it in mind, you can either hard mail a check, or you can come here in person and give an offering however you want. Again, thanks again. Appreciate everyone that has come. Lord bless you and keep you. Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace through Jesus the Messiah. Amen.
Amen.
We'll see you guys next month.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, God bless you. Bye-bye.